You're being let go effective immediately. My name is Ethan Ward. I am 39 years old and had spent 12 years at ArcLight Technologies. 12 years of late nights, cancelled vacations, and designing the workflow systems that kept their entire operation running. The chandeliers glittered like frozen constellations above me, throwing their fractured light across a sea of polished suits and champagne flutes. I sat stiff in my chair, shoulders drawn in, trying to convince myself that this night was the summit of everything I had sacrificed for. 10 years of devotion to ArcLight Technologies, 10 years of midnight coding sessions, missed birthdays, and apologies left unsaid to the people I once called family. Tonight, I told myself, it would all be worth it. I rested a hand on the lanyard hanging from my neck. The badge bore my name, Ethan Ward, Product Architect, a title that had once filled me with pride, but lately felt like an afterthought on corporate paperwork. Still, when I looked at it, I reminded myself, this is who I am. This is what I've built. The ballroom was humming with applause as Victor Hale, the CEO, took the stage. He was a man whose silver hair had been groomed by money and time itself, his voice smooth as glass, designed to sell futures that didn't yet exist. He raised a hand, and silence fell. I leaned forward, anticipation tugging me out of my chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight we unveil the next chapter of ArcLight's vision, a breakthrough system that will redefine the way industries move, adapt, and grow." A murmur ran through the audience, the kind of ripple you hear before a storm. My chest tightened. I knew what he was about to reveal. I had spent years perfecting it. The workflow platform I had poured myself into like it was my only child. Every line of code was my handwriting, every structure a reflection of the way my mins de-organized chaos. On the screen behind him, the logo bloomed. ArcFlow. My breath caught. It was unmistakably my system. Renamed, polished with marketing gloss. But I could see its bones. My bones. Victor's voice swelled. "This proprietary innovation will revolutionize efficiency, integrating across industries seamlessly. ArcLight is proud to lead the future." The applause was thunderous, but all I heard was silence. A roar pressed against my ears, like the ocean filling my head. My hands went cold. I couldn't even clap. I sat there, a ghost in the middle of the celebration, watching my life's work stripped of my name, paraded as if I had never existed. And then came the knife, clean and deliberate. "As we embrace this transformation," Victor continued, his tone suddenly grave, "we will also undergo a period of strategic restructuring. Some roles, regrettably, will be made redundant to align with our new direction. But know this, ArcLight values every contribution that brought us here." I felt my stomach drop. I didn't need to check my inbox to know. Those words weren't for the room. They were for me. The irony was exquisite. My creation was being reborn without me, while I was erased under the banner of strategic restructuring. My loyalty translated into redundancy, my identity dissolved into applause. I sat frozen long after the presentation ended, after the crowd rose for cocktails and networking, after laughter and chatter filled the air. People moved past me as though I were part of the decor, a chair no one noticed. Finally I stood, my legs trembling. The badge against my chest felt heavier than metal. It felt like a headstone. I walked toward the exit, weaving past colleagues who didn't meet my eyes. Perhaps they already knew. Perhaps they were instructed not to. The hotel lobby was quieter, the music faint, the air cooler. I loosened my tie, saz, urging for breath. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. "Ethan!" I turned. It was Mara Delaney, an investor I'd spoken to casually once or twice in board meetings. Sharp eyes, sharper mind. She was the kind of person who noticed details others ignored. She glanced around, then leaned in. "Do you know what they're planning?" My voice was hoarse. "They just told me I don't exist." Her expression tightened. "It's worse than that. They're preparing to sell your system as part of the acquisition deal. Hundreds of millions, Ethan, and they'll call it theirs." Her words landed harder than Victor's speech. A deal. Profit layered on theft. Not only was I being erased, I was being cashed out of my own creation. I wanted to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. I shook my head slowly. 10 years, I whispered. 10 years I gave them. And this is it. This is the thanks. Mara's hand brushed my arm. Not tender, not pitying, but steady. "They're not just cutting you out. They're burying you." She paused, her eyes locking onto mine. "Unless you don't let them." The words lingered, heavy with possibility, but my chest was still too full of humiliation to let them in. I nodded numbly and stepped out into the night. The city air was cold, the kind that bites your lungs when you inhale. I stood there on the curb outside the glittering hotel, jacket unbuttoned, badge still clipped like a cruel joke. Behind me, the ballroom pulsed with light and music. In front of me, the street stretched out, empty and indifferent. I stared at the hotel, its glass walls glowing like a cathedral, but to me, it looked like a mausoleum. Inside, my life's work was embalmed under a false name. My heart pounded. Humiliation, grief, rage. But under it all, something else began to flicker. It was faint, but it was there. Defiance. Back in my apartment that night after the summit, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the lights. The city's glow filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the floor, and I sat in the dark with a half-finished glass of bourbon sweating on tea. Table. The badge from Arclight still hung from my neck, the plastic pressing cold against my chest, refusing to let me forget. I had every reason to rip it off, throw it into the trash, maybe even set it on fire. But I didn't. Instead, I stared at it the way you stare at a scar, wondering how long it had been there before you finally noticed it. That was when my mind, uninvited and relentless, began dragging me back through the years, forcing me to confront the road that had led me here. I was 28 when Arclight first came into my life. The company was barely more than an idea at the time, operating out of a drafty warehouse that smelled of concrete dust and burnt coffee. The floors were littered with cables, the walls plastered with whiteboards covered in half-erased equations and half-formed dreams. To most people, it probably looked chaotic, maybe even unstable. To me, it looked alive. I walked into that space for the first time and thought, this is where I belong. I remember the thrill of slipping on that first employee badge, a simple laminated card with my name printed slightly off-center, and feeling like I had just been knighted into a sacred order. It wasn't just a job. It was a chance to matter. In those early days, I lived for the work. I coded until the sun rose, living on energy drinks and vending machine snacks, convinced that every line I wrote carried the possibility of immortality. My cologne, a cheap brand I'd picked up with my first paycheck, became part of my ritual, sprayed across my collar before every long night, as though it were armor. Years later, my ex-wife would tell me she had grown to hate that scent because it reminded her of how absent I was. At the time, though, it was the smell of ambition, of promise, of loyalty binding me to something larger than myself. I gave Arclight everything. I skipped birthdays and holiday, so I made excuses to my family, convincing them and myself that I was doing it for us, that one day we'd reap the rewards. My wife, Claire, stood by me at first. She even brought me dinners to the office, sitting quietly in the corner while I hammered away at code, her presence a gentle reminder of the life waiting outside those walls. But over time her visits stopped, replaced by late-night arguments and silences that stretched longer each year. I always told myself I'd make it up to her once I crossed the finish line, but I never saw that the line kept moving farther away. The workflow system that eventually became my magnum opus didn't appear all at once. It grew slowly, a living organism shaped by sleepless nights and relentless tinkering. I saw it not just as software, but as something almost human. Every function a heartbeat, every line of logic a vein carrying blood through its body. It was designed to bring order to chaos, to shine light where companies drowned in fog. In truth, I think I built it because I wanted those things for myself. When I first showed an early version to Victor Hale, our CEO, his eyes lit up with that polished enthusiasm of his. He clapped me on the back and said, "Brilliant, Ethan. This could be our cornerstone." At the time, I heard nothing but praise. The word "our" filled me with pride, as if he were inviting me into a brotherhood of visionaries. Only years later did I realize "our" was the first theft, the quiet beginning of my erasure. There were other signs, of course, but I brushed them aside. I remember staying awake for 2 straight days preparing a demo that I thought would cement my place as a leader within the company. When the day came, my carefully crafted presentation had been replaced by glossy slides from the marketing team. My notes, my diagrams, my name, all gone. A colleague delivered the pitch in my place, while I sat in the back of the room clapping politely. I told myself recognition didn't matter, that what mattered was the work itself. Another time I was promised a bonus, a reward for months of sacrifice. When it never arrived, the explanation was that funds had been reallocated to support growth. I told myself the money would come later, but later kept vanishing, replaced by the same empty gratitude. Some of my co-workers tried to warn me. Jared, a developer who eventually quit, pulled me aside one afternoon, his voice low. "You're too trusting, Ethan. They're milking you dry." I laughed, waved him off and said, "That's loyalty." "No," he replied, eyes hard. "That's blindness." At the time, I dismissed him as bitter. I couldn't see what he saw, or maybe I refused to. Claire saw it too. One night, I found her standing in the doorway of my home office at 2 a.m, arms crossed, robe hanging loosely around her. Her eyes were red, her voice brittle when she asked, "Do you even know what today is?" I blinked at the code on my screen, rubbed my temples and guessed, "Tuesday?" Her lips trembled. "It's our anniversary." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. She turned and walked down the hall, the sound of her footsteps fading like a warning I couldn't hear. I told myself I would make it up to her next year, but there wasn't a next year. When she left quietly, placing her wedding ring on my desk beside a stack of technical diagrams. I didn't notice it until hours later. The ring lay there, small and final, catching the light like a verdict. She didn't take my cologne with her. She didn't take the photos from our last vacation. She didn't take my apologies. She just left the ring and a sentence I've never been able to forget. "You love that company more than me. One day they'll leave you too." Back then, I told myself she was bitter, that she couldn't understand what it meant to devote yourself to something greater than comfort. But tonight, after the summit, her words echoed like a prophecy. She had seen the truth years before I dared to. I sipped the bourbon again, the burn spreading down my throat, and set the glass beside the badge. Next to it, I placed Claire's ring. Yes, I still kept it, tucked away in a drawer. I don't know why I held on to it all these years. Maybe because it reminded me of the cost of loyalty, of what I had already lost long before Arclight decided to finish the job. Looking at the 2 objects together, the badge and the ring, I realized they were both symbols of faith I had given freely, believing they would protect me, bind me to something lasting. But in the end, both had become relics of betrayal. The dawn crept through the blinds, soft and indifferent. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the pale light spreading across the ceiling, and let the truth settle heavy in my chest. I had been building on an illusion. I thought loyalty was a currency, that if I poured enough of myself into others, it would be repaid. But loyalty, I finally understood, is only worth something if it flows in both directions. Otherwise, it's just surrender dressed up as virtue. And for 10 long years, I had surrendered without even knowing it. The launch event was held in a gleaming hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago, a place dressed up to look like the future itself. I remember the walls first, massive LED panels pulsing with shifting colors, displaying ArcLight's logo as if it were the sun we were all meant to orbit. Rows of pristine white chairs stretched in perfect symmetry, facing a stage where a glossy black podium stood like an altar. The air carried that faint scent of polished marble and citrus cleaner, the kind that makes everything feel sterile, unreal. I had been invited, though not to speak. My badge still granted me entry, though by now it felt more like a visitor's pass than proof of belonging. I walked into the ballroom, shoulders heavy, and found a seat halfway back. As I lowered myself into the chair, I caught a faint trace of my old cologne clinging to my shirt. That sour aim scent Claire once hated. I hadn't worn it on purpose. It was just left in the fibers of old clothes. Yet in that moment, the smell became a cruel reminder of a time when I believed loyalty had weight, when I thought the company's future was mine too. People filed in around me, buzzing with anticipation. Their conversations blurred together, praise for Victor Hale's leadership, excitement about the revolutionary workflow system ArcLight had perfected. Each word was a dagger wrapped in silk, because I knew what they were applauding. They were here to bury me, though no one realized it. They were here for the funeral of my name. The lights dimmed, and music swelled from hidden speakers, the kind of corporate anthem designed to sound like destiny calling. The stage lit up, and Victor stepped forward, his suit glimmering under the LEDs, his smile practiced and presidential. The crowd erupted in applause. I clapped too, though my hands felt made of stone. "Today," Victor began, his voice carrying that polished warmth he wore like a second skin, "we unveil a system that will change the way companies work forever. A system built on vision, resilience, and innovation. A system we call Ether Flow." The name hit me like a blow to the chest. Ether Flow. Not the name I had whispered to myself in late-night sessions. Not the private monikers I had given it when it was still a fragile experiment. Not even the code name my team once used. No. This was something glossy, marketable, focus grouped to perfection. A name scrubbed clean of me. The screen behind him came alive with graphics, showing the system in action. My system. My heartbeat, my years, my sleepless nights. Every diagram, every interface bore my fingerprints, though they were invisible to everyone else. The audience gasped and nodded, dazzled by what they believed was Victor's creation. His words washed over them, like scripture: innovation, disruption, transformation. My words, once spoken in cramped conference rooms and scribbled across whiteboards, now echoed in his voice, polished and stripped of their origin. I felt something inside me unravel. My hands trembled in my lap. My mouth went dry. It was like watching someone deliver your eulogy while you were still alive, sitting in the pews, powerless to stand up and protest. A memory surfaced, sharp and uninvited. Claire standing in our kitchen years ago, holding the wedding ring before placing it on the counter. "One day they'll leave you too," she had said. At the time, I thought she meant abandonment, betrayal. But sitting in that ballroom, I understood her prophecy more clearly. They hadn't just left me, they had erased me. I reached into my pocket and closed my hand around the ring I still carried. Its edges were cool against my skin, grounding me in the middle of the spectacle. In my other pocket, the plastic badge pressed against my thigh, that relic of a loyalty no one had asked for, but everyone had taken. 2 talismans of my life, one from a woman who once believed in me, the other from a company that had devoured me. Both symbols of faith, both now symbols of loss. As Victor's voice soared, promising a future shaped by ether flow, the crowd rose to its feet, applause thundering through the hall. I remained seated. My body refused to stand, my legs rooted to the floor. I stared at the stage through a haze of grief, realizing that this wasn't just a launch, it was a burial. They weren't celebrating a system. They were lowering my name into the ground, covering it with polished dirt, and planting Arclight's banner in its place. In that moment, I felt strangely outside myself. The applause blurred, the lights dimmed in my eyes, and the sound of my own breath filled my ears. It was as if I were floating above the room, watching a ceremony that had nothing to do with me, a ghost witnessing the funeral of his own identity. I thought about the cologne again, the scent that had once meant ambition. Now it clung to me like decay, the odor of a body left too long in the ground. I thought about the ring, cold in my palm, the echo of a promise I had broken. I thought about the badge, heavy against my leg, proof of my willingness to surrender myself for recognition that would never come. All of them, symbols of loyalty misplaced. When the presentation ended, the crowd swarmed forward, eager to congratulate Victor and the executives lined beside him. I stayed in my chair watching from the shadows, the smiles, the handshakes, the photographs, all proof that history was being written without me. And in that realization, something shifted deep inside. For 10 years, I had believed my legacy would be carved into the architecture of Arclight. But legacy isn't built in the hands of those who erase you. Legacy, I finally understood, is fragile, easily stolen, easily buried. And if you let others write your story, they'll write you out of it. I left the ballroom quietly, unnoticed, slipping out a side door while the celebration roared behind me. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and sobering. I walked through the city streets, neon signs flickering overhead, the sound of distant traffic humming like a dirge. My reflection in a shop window caught me by surprise. Older than I remembered, shoulders bent, eyes hollow. I looked like a man who had just buried something sacred. And I had. That night, as I sat back in my apartment with the badge, the ring, and the faint trace of cologne still clinging to me, I whispered the truth aloud for the first time. They killed my name. The words felt final, like dirt hitting a coffin. And as much as it shattered me, it also stripped away the illusion I had been clinging to. For years, I had mistaken loyalty for legacy, sacrifice for immortality. But all I had really done was attend my own funeral in a crowded ballroom, clapping along with everyone else as the last trace of my identity was lowered into the ground. And now, all that remained was the silence after the burial, and the question of what I would do next. The first thing I did after the launch wasn't sleep. It was open a drawer. Back in my apartment, the city still buzzing from Arclight's triumph, I slid the drawer of my desk open and pulled out a stack of old notebooks and external drives. They were heavy with dust, but the weight wasn't just physical. These were my chronicles, my private ledger of every hour, every line of code, every sketch on a napkin that had led to the system they now called Etherflow. I laid them across the desk, the lamplight spilling gold onto their worn covers. And for the first time in years, I opened them not with pride, but with suspicion. The pages stared back at me like a mirror of forgotten nights. Formulas scribbled during 2 a.m. Coffee highs, sketches I had once believed were glimpses of the future. I ran my fingers over the ink, remembering how I had clung to those drawings as proof that I mattered. Now they felt like tombstones. But it wasn't grief anymore. It was something harder, sharper. A different kind of clarity had entered me since that night in the ballroom. At the launch, I had buried my name. But now, in the solitude of my apartment, I was exhuming the evidence. Not of my legacy, but of my betrayal, I began compiling. Not out of strategy, but instinct. Dates, prototypes, emails I had saved, screenshots of code commits with my name in the metadata. Each entry became a tally mark, each mark another nail in the coffin of Victor's myth. The desk transformed into something ritualistic, my own courtroom, my own altar of reckoning. The badge sat at the corner of the desk, its plastic edge catching the light. I set it there on purpose, like a witness forced to look at the crime it had enabled. That badge had been the key, the silent partner to my sacrifice. I thought of how many times I had swiped it through security gates, exhausted but proud, believing I was entering a temple of progress. Now I realized it had been a turnstile into captivity. The cologne rose faintly from my clothes again, though I hadn't sprayed it in weeks. It clung stubbornly to me, like a ghost that refused to leave. I breathed it in, bitter this time, as if the scent itself were mocking me. Once ambition, now residue. The smell of wanting too much. And the ring. I kept turning it over in my palm between notes. The grooves had worn smooth over time, and I remembered Claire's fingers tracing them once, back when she still believed I was building something worthy of devotion. But as I turned it now, I thought of her warning. One day, they'll leave you too. She hadn't just meant leaving. She had meant this ledger, this collection of betrayals, written in my own hand. The more I catalogued, the more the grief hardened into something like anger. Not fire, not yet, but the cold, surgical anger of realization. Every spreadsheet I uncovered, every time-stamped design, every memo with my words regurgitated later by someone else was another entry in the betrayal ledger. A system not of innovation, but of theft, carefully disguised as loyalty. And as I sifted, I started to notice something else. A pattern. There were emails from Victor that at the time had felt encouraging, generous even. Brilliant work, Ethan. Let's circle back on this. Or, you've given me something we can build on together. Words that once warmed me now read like scripts, tools of extraction dressed as praise. Each line was a scalpel cutting away a piece of my ownership. My pen moved across the notebook, turning the raw matters, aerials of my grief into evidence. It wasn't just a system anymore. It was a ledger of debts unpaid, loyalty unreturned, trust betrayed. And I wasn't just the builder anymore. I was the auditor. My pen moved across the notebook, turning the raw materials of my grief into evidence. It wasn't just a system anymore. It was a ledger of debts unpaid, loyalty unreturned, trust betrayed. And I wasn't just the builder anymore. I was the auditor. Hours slipped by. The city outside quieted. The traffic subsided. But my desk only grew heavier with papers and drives and notes. The lamplight dimmed as the bulb wore itself thin, flickering now and then, as if to remind me time was passing, that I was still here, still cataloguing the past. But the act was changing me. Each note was no longer a dirge. It was a record. Each record was no longer just grief. It was testimony. And as the ledger grew, I felt the shift inside. I was no longer mourning the funeral of my name. I was preparing its exhumation. By dawn, my desk looked like a crime scene. Not blood, but ink. Not bullets, but timestamps. Not fingerprints, but metadata. And in the middle of it all sat the badge, the ring, and the faint smell of cologne that had soaked into the pages, turning the desk itself into an altar of betrayal. I leaned back, exhausted, my eyes burning from the hours of reading and writing. I stared at the objects in front of me, those cursed symbols of loyalty and loss, and for the first time I spoke not a lament, but a promise. They will not write me out. The words came out low, gravelly, like they had been buried in my throat for years. Saying them felt like breaking a chain. The badge glared under the light, plastic and cheap. The ring gleamed faintly, metal and unyielding. The cologne hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Together, they were no longer relics of grief. They were exhibits. And I knew then that grief had been a coffin, but anger was a door. The ledger I had built wasn't just proof of what they had taken. It was the blueprint for what I could reclaim, the Loys. Al Builder had died in that ballroom. But here at my desk, with the evidence spread before me, another version of me was being born. And he wasn't loyal anymore. I used to believe war started with trumpets, an announcement, a clash, a declaration. But in truth, my war began with silence. After cataloguing the evidence, after turning my grief into the betrayal ledger, I did not storm the gates of Arclight or confront Victor in a blaze of fury. Instead, I began showing up in unexpected places, coffee shops with my laptop, libraries where no one knew me, quiet corners where my notebooks lay open like prayer books. Outwardly, I was just another man typing, but inwardly, every keystroke was a weapon being sharpened. The badge still sat on my desk, stripped of its power, a relic of captivity. Each morning, before I left the apartment, I touched it. Not out of nostalgia, but ritual. It reminded me that I had walked willingly into a machine that devoured me. Now I carried the memory like a scar. The cologne, I stopped wearing it. Yet somehow its ghost lingered, especially when I opened my closet, seeping out from old suits I had once worn proudly at summits and boardroom presentations. The smell used to symbolize ambition. Now it reeked of submission. Every time I caught a trace, I tightened my jaw and wrote another line of code. And the ring, Claire's ring, had migrated from my nightstand to the center of my desk. I had placed it there deliberately, next to the betrayal ledger. It wasn't about mourning her anymore. It was about remembering the cost of blindness. Every glance at the ring whispered, "You ignored the warnings once. Don't ignore them again." The quiet war was not about noise. It was about precision. I started with the code. In the dead hours of the night, while the city's windows went dark, I re-entered the system I had built. Not Arclight servers. No, that was locked to me now. But the architecture lived in me, in sketches, in old backups that had survived on forgotten drives. I wasn't just reconstructing, I was improving. I was laying bricks for something leaner, faster, sharper, something that would not only match what Arclight had stolen, but eclipse it. It felt illicit, though technically it wasn't. These were my ideas, my drafts, my intellectual children. But the very act of revisiting them carried a pulse of danger, like I was reaching into forbidden ground. My fingers trembled at first, but soon muscle memory took over, the same way a soldier grips a rifle after years of practice. By day I looked ordinary. I went for walks, bought groceries, nodded at neighbors. But beneath the surface, I was tightening a bowstring. Each note I wrote in the betrayal ledger, each line of code, each diagram pinned to the wall of my apartment was another inch drawn back. And then came Eleanor Chen. She had been at the summit that night, a name on the periphery, an investor whose sharp eyes had cut through Victor's performance. Weeks later she found me, or maybe I allowed myself to be found. A brief message on LinkedIn, as innocuous as rain. "I know what they did. Let's talk." We met at a dim cafe downtown. She arrived in a dark coat, no jewelry, her hair pinned simply, but her presence was undeniable. She carried herself like someone who had been burned before, and perhaps that was why I trusted her. "You built it," she said without preamble, leaning across the table. I've been in this business long enough to know when a man's work is stolen." Her words landed like water on parched soil. For months I had been living in silence, surrounded by symbols of betrayal, compiling evidence for an audience of one. Now, suddenly, there was someone else in the room, someone who saw me. I didn't spill everything at once. The quiet war had taught me patience. Instead, I slid one of my notebooks across the table, open to a page of sketches that matched the polished demo Arclight had flaunted at the summit. She studied it, then looked at me with eyes that weren't pitying but calculating. "If you want to fight back, you'll need more than proof," she said. "You'll need something alive, something they can't bury." The words lingered long after she left. Proof was what I had, but alive was what I needed to create. So I doubled down. My apartment became a workshop. Walls plastered with notes, lines of code glowing across multiple screens. The betrayal ledger grew heavier, but beside it grew something else. A prototype, fragile but breathing. And with every iteration, every bug I crushed, every new feature that sparked, I felt myself shifting from mourner to maker again. The city outside barely touched me. I missed birthdays, skipped calls, ignored invitations. People thought I was withdrawing. They didn't know I was waging a war in silence. Yet the symbols haunted me still. Some nights, I would wake with the scent of cologne in my nose, the ghost of my old life pressing on my chest. I'd stumble to the desk, look at the badge, the ring, the ledger, and remind myself, never again. The ring was the hardest. Sometimes I caught myself turning it in my hand, as if I could summon Claire back, rewind time to when her faith in me was unbroken. But then I remembered how she had walked out, how she had said the words that gutted me. "You gave everything to them, and nothing to us." And I realized she had been part of the ledger too. Not a thief, but a witness to my blindness. The ring wasn't a plea anymore. It was a scar. Eleanor returned weeks later. This time I showed her the beginnings of the new system. She watched silently as I walked her through its interface, the fluidity, the improvements. When I finished, she sat back, eyes gleaming. "They can't outpace this," she said. "Not without you. And they don't have you anymore." Her words cut through me, not as flattery, but as recognition. The quiet war wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself. And so the plan began to take form, not in speeches, not in declarations, but in quiet decisions. Eleanor would handle the capital, I would handle the architecture. Together we would seed a rival, a ghost rising from the grave they thought they had dug for me. The war wasn't loud. It was whispers over coffee, drafts of contracts exchanged in encrypted emails, nights spent coding until dawn, with only the hum of the city as witness. It was moving money discreetly, registering names under the radar, creating a foundation before Arclight even realized a storm was coming. The badge, the ring, the cologne, they remained on the desk, silent sentinels. But now they didn't mock me. They reminded me. Each was a scar, and scars don't fade. They guide. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when exhaustion bent me double, when I stared at the code and thought, what if I fail again? What if they crush me once more? But then I would open the ledger, trace the lines of betrayal with my finger, and remember, this wasn't just survival. This was justice. The quiet war stretched on for months. To the world, I was a ghost, a man fading after losing his place in the machine. To myself, I was becoming sharper, harder, leaner. By the time the prototype was stable, by the time Eleanor had lined up the first clients willing to defect from Arclight, I realized something startling. I was no longer afraid. The grief was gone. The anger had burned clean. What remained was resolve. War didn't need trumpets. It needed silence, patience, and the unyielding will to strike when the moment was right. And when that moment came, I would not just confront them. I would bury them with the very silence they had used to erase me. I used to think reckoning would feel like thunder, like the sky splitting open and declaring its judgment. But when the moment finally arrived, it was quieter than I had imagined. No drum roll, no orchestra, just the dull thud of my heartbeat as I walked back into the very hotel where my name had been buried 2 years before. The summit hall had changed little. The same chandeliers gleamed overhead, dripping light like molten glass. The same velvet curtains framed the stage where I had once stood as a ghost, watching Victor parade my work as if it were his. Even the scent in the air was familiar, a blend of polished wood, champagne, and that faint cologne Victor always favored, sharp, metallic, almost sterile. My throat tightened at it, a cruel callback to the evenings I had worn it myself, believing I was cloaked in power when in truth I was suffocating in servitude. But this time, I wasn't a ghost. Helios Systems stood behind me, invisible but alive. Eleanor had pulled the threads together. Investors, early adopters, contracts sealed in secrecy until tonight. The prototype had become a living system, tested, refined, unshakable, and tonight was its unveiling. The world thought Arclight still held the crown, but crowns melt when the fire is hot enough. I stepped onto the stage. The murmur of the audience dimmed, then faded, curiosity sharpening into silence. I didn't look for Victor immediately. I didn't need to. His presence was a shadow I could feel without seeing. Instead, I opened with the story. Not all of it, not the betrayal ledger, not the night staring at Claire's ring, but enough. I once believed innovation was about machines, I began, my voice steady, filling the hall without strain. But I learned the hard way it's about people. And when trust is broken, machines become weapons. The screens behind me lit up with Helios, clean, elegant, undeniably superior to what Arclight had flaunted years ago. I walked the audience through the features, not with the desperation of a man proving himself, but with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Every movement of my hands, every shift of TE, felt rehearsed by grief and refined by rage. Only once did I allow myself to glance toward him. Victor sat near the front, flanked by board members and polished smiles. For a moment our eyes met, and I saw the recognition dawn. That sharp flicker when a predator realizes the prey is no longer cowering, but circling back with teeth bared. He didn't flinch. Neither did I. The badge was not in my pocket. I had left it at home deliberately. It was no longer mine to carry, no longer a chain. But in my mind, I could see it still, the cold glint of metal stripped from me. Tonight I was melting that badge down into fire. The ring was with me, though. Not on my finger, but in my jacket, heavy against my chest. Claire wasn't here, and perhaps she never would be again. But I wanted her ghost near me, wanted the reminder of what blindness had cost. Every word I spoke carried the weight of that absence, as if I were speaking not only to investors and rivals, but to the silence she had left behind. And the cologne. I smelled it again when Victor rose, slowly, as the applause broke out around me. He moved toward me with deliberate grace, a serpent uncoiling. The scent of him, metallic, arrogant, filled the air as he extended his hand. Cameras flashed. To the world, it looked like courtesy. To me, it was a funeral. "Impressive," he said, his voice pitched low enough for only me to hear. "But you and I both know who built the stage you're standing on." I didn't take his hand. Instead, I leaned closer, matching his volume. "Yes, and you burned it down with my work still inside. Tonight, I build my own." The photographers captured the tension, though they didn't know what they saw. To them it was rivalry. To us, it was war made visible. Afterward, in the green room, he came to me again, this time without witnesses. His cologne entered first, followed by his measured steps. "You think you can bury me with this?" he asked, gesturing toward the screens where Helios still glowed in looping demos. "You forget. I taught you everything. Without me, you're nothing." The words struck a chord because once they had been true. Once I had worn the badge like a shackle, worn the cologne like a mask, worn my devotion like a ring that blinded me. But not now. "You didn't teach me," I said quietly, evenly. "You stole me. There's a difference." He laughed, low and bitter, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. Power doesn't crack all at once. It fractures first like glass. I stepped closer, so he could see the fire in my eyes, so the scent of his cologne no longer dominated but burned. "And here's what you've forgotten, Victor. You can't own a man who has nothing left to lose. You can't leash someone who's already burned." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The air thickened, the silence almost unbearable. Then he turned, mask snapping back into place, and walked out. That was the last time I spoke to him face to face. In the weeks that followed, the reckoning fire spread. Helios drew clients like moths, each one another ember leaping from the blaze. Arclight stumbled, then faltered, then began to crack under the weight of its hollow foundation. I didn't need to destroy them with lawsuits or headlines. I destroyed them by living, by creating, by building, by showing the world what real innovation looked like when it wasn't stolen. But the reckoning wasn't just external. It lived inside me too. The badge stayed in its drawer, untouched, a relic of chains I no longer needed. The cologne. I threw the last bottle away, watching the glass shatter in the dumpster like a headstone breaking. And the ring, Claire's ring. I returned to its box. Not because I was finished grieving, but because I was ready to let the wound heal, instead of tearing it open every night. The ledger, though, the betrayal ledger, I didn't burn it. I kept it, locked away, not as a shrine, but as a map of scars. It reminded me that fire is born from kindling, and that silence, if carried long enough, can roar louder than thunder. The reckoning fire didn't consume me. It forged me. When I look back now, I don't see the summit as the place they buried my name. I see it as the place I was reborn, tempered in betrayal, remade in silence, and unleashed in flame. And somewhere, I imagine Claire might see me too, not as the man who gave everything away, but as the man who finally learned how to fight. If this story struck a chord with you, if you've ever carried scars others tried to write over, don't stay silent. Share it. Subscribe for more stories of betrayal, survival, and the quiet wars we all fight in the shadows. Because sometimes the only way to keep the fire alive is to pass the flame forward.